Okay, for the State Shooting Complex Oversight Task Force meeting date March 15th, 2024, Senator Kolb,
He's excused. He's in Washington, D.C.
thank you. Representative Ottman? I saw you, so I assume you're here.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Mr. Corsi?
Present.
Mr. Davidson?
Here.
I believe we have Ron Goldberg for the Business Council.
Yes, present.
For State Parks and Cultural Resources, Mr. Glenn?
Good morning.
Ms. Legursky?
Hello, y'all.
Mr. Maestas?
Here.
I believe we have Nish Giocolia for Game and Fish.
Here.
James Schoon, Tourism Board.
Good morning.
Co-Chairman Hicks.
Here.
And I believe we'll have Co-Chairman Washit shortly. So I
Yeah.
will note him as excused now and pending.
They're lost in cyberspace.
You have a quorum.
All right. Thank you, Karen. Well, just wanted to first just thank everybody for getting back together on these. I don't have a lot of opening remarks. What I was pleasantly surprised that we had 8 proposals. One of the things that we need to discuss this morning, there was actually another proposal that came in, I believe, 7 or 8 days late. And one of the questions that, and again, I've had this discussion with Art as to whether we wanted to go ahead and entertain that proposal, but really we thought it was more appropriate to basically, rather than make a unilateral decision, is to put that out to you members of the task force and get your input as to whether we should entertain a proposal that came in a week late or not. So for first item on the agenda, before we get into the other proposals, I'd just like to kind of go through each one of you guys and get your thoughts on whether we should entertain an additional proposal that came in late. So I'll just go down the list and start calling names. And so let me start with Aaron. You're in the hot seat. What's your thoughts about including a week late proposal for this project?
I think in the spirit of being inclusive and trying to find the best solution for the state, I say we include it. Let's suggest that today's meeting's the real deadline. So maybe that can be enough cover for us to allow that. My vote.
Okay. Josh, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with Aaron. I think it also gives us the opportunity to establish that, moving forward, deadlines are hard deadlines, and there just won't be that leniency provided in the future, and everyone's aware of it.
Hey, Josh, what's that thing looking over your shoulder?
That would be a raccoon.
Oh, okay.
A very troubling raccoon that's been memorialized. So
I just wanted to check. I thought that's what it was, but anyway, Judy, what's your thoughts on including another proposal?
I have no objections. I'd hate to miss the perfect site because of a.
So Representative Ottman.
Well, I guess if that seems to be the consensus that everybody wants to make sure of that, sure, I'll go along with it.
Ron?
I think I'll side with the private industry and foundation folks here. I think their input's important. And I would say, I think this will have potentially 9 letters of interest, and everybody that's participating in the RFP or chooses to will now know that we have deadlines, to Josh's point, that no more broken deadlines, but I would defer to the private folks on this.
So James, what's your thoughts?
I would go along with exactly what Ron said. And yeah, from here on out, I mean, we have hard deadlines on all of this stuff. And I think it's, I don't want to miss out on a great shooting range just because they missed a deadline for the first one with the RFP coming up. So I'm with everybody else.
So Nish,
I'm good with that as well.
and last but not least, Dave.
Yeah, I'm fine with it. I'm a deadline guy. Bothers me that it's a week late when they've had 3 months to do it. But I can go along with the group on this.
All right. Well, I visited with Art and we kind of said we'll go with the group. Our gut and our initial instinct was you've had 2 months and would be to not include it, but I think we'll just go with the group. So the other proposal came from a group in Sheridan, Wyoming. So Karen, if you will get that out to the other group or to the members of the task force, so we've got that, people can have that access. I mean, I wasn't going to go over these proposals in detail this morning. I did want to get a sense of the letters of interest from, again, each and every one of you. If you thought there was some strong points or things that we need to make sure that we included. I don't think we need a full-blown environmental assessment of a potential site at this point in time. But what I'd like to do is kind of go through those and not talk about necessarily the merits as much as there's things that that you guys saw in those 8 proposals that maybe we need to incorporate some of that into the RFP. And so what I'll do is I'm going to start out one that became, I think, apparent to me on this when I went through all these proposals was one of the things that I don't think that we captured that we have talked about, I think, extensively at the task forces. We haven't specifically called out what are those factors that you tend that if this facility is built in your area, they're going to attract and retain people for a number of days past that. Now, we had asked for what amenities and what other things that might be available out there, and I think this comes back to maybe some help from tourism as to how we would craft that in there to make sure I call it the hold factor. So if you come out for an event, what's going to hold them in this area, Wyoming, for a couple more days? And so what would that be if this facility was in your location? And that's something that right now in the RFP, I don't think we have called that out. As far as what's your plan, what are those amenities? And so that was the first thing that when I went through all of the proposals that I jotted down and that wasn't clear in the letters of intent. So what I want to do is just open it up for a broad discussion now. Is there anything else folks saw in those letters of intent that we need to make sure that we are explicitly clear in the RFP that's incorporated? Anybody have any thoughts?
I think the two that jumped out at me the most from not every proposal, but quite a few, we talked in our meetings a bunch about topography and how Cameo was kind of the standard, and we didn't want it to be just another flat piece of sagebrush. And I think the RFP captures that, when I saw the draft RFP, when it talks about, multiple vegetation and everything, but I think we might have let people spin their wheels for a couple of months going the wrong direction without giving them some of that guideline. And now there's some tight timeframes to turn it. And in the same vein, the same thing was the acquisition and construction timeframe. The fact that from decision making and announcement to actually being able to, put shovels into the dirt, we're talking about from February of next year with authorization and final approval at the state level, and trying to get shovels in the ground by July. Some of these private acquisitions and especially the federal acquisitions are just probably not realistic timelines that some people have poured a lot of effort into.
Yeah, I would say on that issue, Kate, that was the one thing that jumped out onto me is that many of the proposals are just basically grass and flat sagebrush. They're more traditional, ranges and didn't have that thing that we tried to describe as the wow factor associated with it. Do you think that what we currently have in the draft RFP language is explicit enough? I think some of them are going to have to go back to the drawing board to look for other sites, would be my interpretation. Does that characterize kind of what you're thinking too?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you've called that out a couple of times pretty loudly at meetings, that's what was super important to you, is that topography and that change. But we kind of let them run on a letter of interest, which was really, I think, the biggest time chunk that they had, right? Like the last couple of months since our meeting in Cody to do all this homework. And now we start tightening the screws on timeline. And so some of those that may choose to go back to the drawing board are kind of behind the eight ball for that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So any other thoughts, anybody, on just general and proposals, or that issue in specific as topography and timeframes?
Well, I would want to caution us, Mr. Chairman, on anything that involves BLM land. The civilian marksmanship program at this point is about 1 3/4 years into waiting to access some land near Payson, Utah for a much larger range than what we're contemplating. And it's on BLM land, and this has been an absolute nightmare. So I don't think anything that we want to get involved in here if we're expecting to get it done within the next half century.
Yeah, and Judy, I thought we tried to make that pretty clear that if you're involving BLM or Forest Service, I deal a lot with those agencies, and just trying to get a land transfer or even an easement to conduct these kind of activities is not to say that it can't be done. It's always been a concern of mine. I know there was one proposal that had a significant amount of BOR land in their Bureau Reclamation, which may or may not be easier to deal with the BLM. But I thought we tried to discourage people from that, not saying that we wouldn't consider it, but I think it interjects just tremendous amount of uncertainty. Getting back to Cade's point on the time frame, I think we got to be pretty explicit in the RFP. If you're including federal lands, you have got to have some level of commitment in place versus this is where we want to do it. And go ahead and give it to us, and then we'll work on it for the next decade, or whatever that time frame is. So I guess I would reiterate what you said is primarily, is very important to look at that, is those federal lands.
I've seen some of the local discussions here in Cody. One of the Gunworks staff is assisting with some committee duties for the local team. It doesn't sound like the people that are leasing state lands are going to want to share very easily. So I suspect that there's going to be some conflicts there, that you might have some maybe something that we could figure out a way to help mitigate, with our statewide committee. That looks like a concern. Another one that I saw is have we stressed enough in our request for proposal how important the governance structure, which kind of lends towards how are you going to fund this thing and how are you going to run it? And I really feel that perhaps some of the key people that are involved and who they are and what their experience level, I don't know that we've talked about, the people that are involved in the event, but or the local committees or the governance. I think the people that are involved in this are going to be a key part of success. It might be something that we want to understand who and how, their expertise will lend to a successful, development and implementation. I think that's key. Another one that I saw that I think is going to become an issue, maybe just for us as a committee for evaluating, but how do we know that the site works for the shooting sports functionality, et cetera, for the state? Like, how are we going to evaluate, oh, that site looks good? Because it might look pretty, and I've seen a few sites proposed. It might look pretty, it might have some shape, it might have some topography, but it doesn't break itself up or lend itself well to the type of shooting sports, then it actually wouldn't evaluate as good. So as we start getting into that, maybe something we should be considering is how we're going to systematically say, ooh, that piece of land is actually really going to work well for these core shooting activities that we've identified are the mainstream, and this is the reasons why they work that way. I see that maybe as sneaking up on us when we actually start trying to do site evaluation.
So on that issue, some of the proposals we had actually had a layout on some of that. They had conceptual layouts on a parcel of land and stuff. And again, I don't know that this was a letter of interest, but I would share that concern that on the two issues, the three issues as far as land have come up as, state, federal. We're going to have to address that. I'll talk a little bit about the state when we get through this. But that piece of land, and does it actually lend itself to a layout and stuff? And so on that, Aaron, do you have an idea of a conceptual layout? I mean, in my mind, I've always thought, because I don't have a lot of experience with these, been down to Raton, New Mexico, and then Cameo, and someplace in between those, or something similar to those. But how do you think that we as the task force would then look at these different parcels and then say, okay, this fits or it doesn't fit? Do we need to hire additional expertise to be able to do that?
This is my thought. This is where I have some concern. We look at these sites, and I've heard some scuttlebutt about proposed sites here in Cody, obviously, with the proximity that I have. And my initial reaction is, oh, that's too flat, or that's too this, or whatever. And then I sit back and I say, well, wait a minute. Why do I feel we need to have a bunch of topography? And again, I think Cameo, I have a hard time imagining a neater place than Cameo and a better layout and use of space than Cameo. And I think the reason why topography has value is because it lets you organize more functionalities in a safe manner in a smaller space. I think that's the actual function of topography. If you think about all the shooting ranges that were there, like all the opportunities to shoot, there were very few of those actually used any incline or decline or topography as part of the shooting. And the one place where you did have to shoot uphill, I think it was actually an inconvenience more than a feature. And it was just because of the way the layout was. So I'm not sure that a massive amount of topography actually is a requirement for creating a great shooting range and experience. Even even some of the long range stuff, you end up just shooting kind of flat by the time you get a long ways out there. So I was thinking for us to evaluate, just understanding why we want certain things and how that lends itself to a great shooting experience. because I think that we talk a lot about the community and things that draw people, and I think those are really important. And the truth is, most of the towns that put submissions in are awesome communities and have reasons to be there. I mean, Wyoming is awesome in almost all the places, not all of them, but almost all of them. But if you think about what's going to draw people year over year and bring them back and get them talking about it, and kind of something that is really attractive from the shooting professional standpoint, I feel like we need some help here on this committee. You guys probably thought I was going to pitch in and be an expert and help, but I'm not sure that that's the case. I have a very really narrow experience and focus in our industry, but I don't know if it's getting a few advisors, a few people from a few of the different shooting sports, just to be able to provide very specific commentary about their the ranges that they've shot on. You get a few of these competitors that have shot on a dozen or 24 different ranges. I mean, they're all going to have an opinion. That would at least be something that's very concrete that we could process and assess. And I would hope that most of the guys that put a proposal together are going to do something similar. But do we as a committee want to rely on on what they tell us, or do we want to have our own method for evaluating?
So I had that discussion with Art, and in fact, we had tried to run a budget amendment to get a little more money in here to actually bring in some expertise. It's been pretty apparent to me all along is that while we got a lot of expertise on this committee, we don't have all the expertise that we need. And so we do have a little bit of money that we could actually bring in, very type of people that you're talking about. The question is it's not a lot of money, but I don't think if we just paid expenses, maybe I think some of these folks would volunteer if we just pay their plane tickets, motels, travel expenses to come out for a day.
That's the expectation. That would be the expectation.
To do that.
Yeah.
The question is it is a limited budget, and at what point in time do we do that? And that's the question for you guys is, do you bring it out for every proposal, or do we screen it down to some level and then bring it out for whatever that natural break is, whether it's 2 or 5 or so? What's your thoughts on that, Aaron? I mean,
why don't we do this? Why don't we use our connections? And Nephi is a great connection. Cade, I'm sure, has people in shooting sports connections. I can go dig around and find a few people. Maybe what we can do is, first off, identify what are the 5 sports that we want to target. And maybe Judy has some experience here. Maybe she could guide us towards what are the shooting sports that we really want to focus on. And then we go use our connections to invite people to provide some feedback. And maybe what we ask for is, okay, so you're a 3-gun person. You've competed at different places. You've done a lot of traveling. You've been in the sport for a long time. You've seen it mature. You kind of have a sense for where it's going. So we get somebody that's got some credibility there. And we don't even fly them anywhere. We just get on a meeting, or we give them an opportunity to provide some feedback. Maybe it's just a 1-page assessment of, for the ultimate range for this sport, this is what I would like to see. And here's some problems that I've seen with other places, things to watch out for. If we just had 5, shooting sports, and 1 or 2 people from each shooting sport submit a little bit of information, which I think with a little work we could get, all of a sudden we could assess that and say, okay, well, based on this information, here's what we think the criteria is for evaluation, or the requirements for those individual things. And break it into real small pieces, focus on that, solve that. And maybe 4 or 5, 6 people on this committee could try to track down 1 or 2 people in a sport individually, and kind of break up the workload, and then bring the information back to I can think of 2 people, 3 people for a PRS type shooting match that could provide that information and would do it for no cost. and give us lots of their opinions. I think we could probably get it done really, really affordably and get at least an 80% solution for our opinion of what those requirements look like.
So that would be something that would be, we could get that even before the RFPs are due back, you think? So we're looking at 60 days, 2 months, and it helps us. The way I understand it, what you're saying, Aaron, is that helps us then look at these facilities, right? When we start screening them down. That's a screening
otherwise
tool,
it's
right?
our opinion. It's either our opinion or it's, you know, our reliance on their points. Like,
yeah, I like the idea of getting some input on the specific ones, because then I think that helps us get back to your original thing as far as, you know, when we start looking at a piece of land and then potential layout, we have some input already on what they're looking at, not specific to that parcel, but just as a general screening tool, right?
Well, Mr. Chairman, excuse me, I don't have the ability to put my little hand on the screen. I believe I'm the only person here who's ever built a range. And we do need expertise. Oh, okay, Aaron. I've got the civilian, the Talladega range. It took a lot of boots on the ground, a lot of expertise. I mean, safety is a huge concern. Topography with a natural backstop is a truly wonderful thing, as anybody who's shot at Ben Avery would know. The shooting fan for each of the disciplines is somewhat different. There is expertise available out there, and it would make sense to me, as opposed to having small groups looking at each discipline, to perhaps have an individual who knows all of that and is able to give us advice early on, so we don't do a lot of wheel spinning and then go, oops, we didn't think about that. And do we want to backtrack?
is there somebody there?
Some people, yeah, I do have one or two people in mind. I just don't know whether they'd be interested. But they might not be free.
Maybe I can wait. Josh, you were ahead of me. You go. I'll go after you and Representative Oppman.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think to piggyback off of a lot of what Aaron has indicated, I think the one thing that resonates with me in looking at this and looking at these 8 proposals was initially the statement made that this was truly meant to be and should be world class. And I think what really needs to be able to determine that is the various disciplines that this wants to be able to attract. I think when you look at the AT8 trap match in Sparta, you know, what is needed for that, the 3-gun nation nationals, the F class. I mean, I think all of those provide so many different needs to be able to accommodate that would tie into what is going to be a requisite for topography, that we really need to determine what is it that we want this to be world class for, to be able to try to facilitate something that would meet the needs of multiple disciplines or all disciplines to be world class. I mean, I think we have the resources out there with Whittington, other sites that we could look at. I think we could solicit some sort of expertise that would come in and potentially even be able to overlook some of these proposals with us and be able to see what could accommodate what. If we really want to be world class, I think we've got to identify first, what is it we want to attract to be world class?
Yeah, so just to reiterate the conversation that myself and the co-chairman had is we recognize that we need to bring some of these folks in. I think back to Aaron saying, if we can get and you know, Judy, with your expertise and contacts, if we can at least get just some basics to help screen some of these down. I think my conversations with Art, and I think we had these conversations with Ron too, with the business council. We talked about going out to the SHOT Show. We just didn't have enough time to organize an event with a lot of these individuals when they were all at one place. But one of the things that we fully anticipate doing is once we get it narrowed down a little bit, is probably actually coming out and bringing them and do a site visit to look at this and look at those things as far as the topography. Is it necessary? Is it adequate? And I don't, so if we need to identify, the top 4 or 5 type of shooting sports, we would try to actually, after we get through the initial screening process, bring them on board and see if they will come and do the site visits with us and even provide input into some of the interview questions that we may not have the expertise on this task force. So I think that's contemplated to do that. I just back to you, Judy, as far as, and I would say Cade and anybody else that wants to weigh in, how much of this do we need up front that when we get the final RFPs in that we can use as a screening tool to narrow it down? We're obviously not going to be able to bring somebody in to go look at 9 different facilities scattered all the way across the state of Wyoming. That's a 2-week tour around this state to try to get around and do all of that. And so what do we need to do? And back to Aaron's thing, maybe it's just Judy, you talking to the folks that you have contact with, and Aaron and Nephi and Cade and anybody else, and say, can you give us some initial criteria that would be necessary for you to be able to have a facility that you would really like to participate in? So I think that's what you're saying, Josh.
Mr. Chairman, if I could throw out, I think there's also a piece that we need to reach out to shooters, right? Because those are the people we're going to attract. But we also need to reach out to people that run these facilities, because we can say this is really cool from a shooting perspective, but from a guy that comes from designing campgrounds, it's really nice to say, boy, it'd be really nice to camp on top of that hill. But as a manager, you go, oh my God, that would be a nightmare. And I think there's got to be a piece of this where we're bringing in people that run those facilities, whether it's after the facility is chosen or before. And I think we're going to need to combine and mesh those two together. The shooters, what is that wow factor that they need, but what a manager needs when you're putting together a facility?
So on that, Dave, don't you think that's the second step after we select a site, before we ever even start the design and construction, is to start looking at saying, now, how are you actually going to do the mechanics of running and before we ever build a campground, we have to have a management plan, right? Versus selecting a site for the campground. I agree with you. I just think it's premature right now to say, let's start talking about how we're going to run it when we don't even know where it's at or what it looks like.
And I agree with that. I also think there are certain aspects that you would maybe say that is not the right location because of the layout, because of how it would need to be run. That's my only piece that makes niggling in the back of my head that makes me nervous.
Well, that's why we have you on here. As a guy that does campgrounds, that's your expertise. So we expect you to say, I don't know about running this facility way out here on top of this windblown hill, but anyway, do you have expertise internally though within your department that you can help? And I would assume that some of the other agencies, that Game and Fish runs a number of facilities, that's something that we have internally within you agencies. I mean, you obviously run a lot of campgrounds, parks. Game and Fish has habitat units and camps and those type of facilities that are similar.
Mr. Chairman, I could say yes, but we don't manage shooting ranges. And so that's the piece. We would need that extra expertise. We've got construction and engineering folks, and I know Game and Fish do as well, that can really help with those types of things. But as far as, okay, how does it flow? How does it work? How do those are pieces we're going to need help with.
Yeah, and I think as we identify the location and start to do the design on the facility, that's when we bring that expertise on as far as those actual range managers, facility managers for those facilities. Maybe it's again the same thing as you bring up somebody from that actually operates a few of these things and see if we can't get them. I mean, when we went to Cameo, we had an offer there from the gentleman that runs that facility that he would be interested in doing some level of maybe private consulting if he's not still employed there. So anyway.
Yeah, no, the last thing I would just throw out, I agree with you wholeheartedly regarding that tourism and marketing plan, maybe trying to put some bones on. We call it one more night, one more cheeseburger, as far as what's going to keep the people there. That's one thing I noticed some put in excellent, here's everything other people can do around the community and others didn't. So I'm supportive of that.
Yeah, so we're still back to this. So I've got a question.
Well, I'd still like to address part of what you've asked now, but Rep. Ottman's had her hand up for a minute, so I wanted to let her
Yeah,
go first.
and I can't see for whatever reason on my screen. I cannot see when you put your hands up. They're not showing up in the little bars. So you'll just have to kind of jump in when you've got. So go ahead, Cade, and then we'll go to Representative Ottman.
She's been up for a little bit, so I'll let her go first.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Kate. I was kind of wondering if maybe I just was doing something wrong. But one of the things that I've been looking at is to look at all of these things. One of the most important things, and it's been mentioned a couple times here, is that this is for a world-class shooting complex. It's not for, a local or an extension. We had looked at land and available land and how much and how it could expand and how a facility may come in and support these disciplines and may support a community, but how that could expand into the future. Because I see something like this being able to function and be here for many, many decades. So as these grow and as this enjoyment comes about. The other thing that I kind of looked at is there's a lot of communities that do have already community things or, say restaurants or things that are already there. But we here in this state have and do push tourism. So are these going to be adequate for the influx that we're looking at? And so how can they be expanded and would they? The other thing that I was kind of looking at is what border, if there's one of these that's very good, okay, is it really going to solicit business into or out of the state? Might it go to the state to the south of us? Might it go to the state to the northeast of us or to the north of us, rather than internally visiting our state and seeing all the different facets that we have? The other thing I was looking at was utilities. Some of these proposed sites have a lot of utilities and things like that, or lands that may not be conducive for building. So we need to make sure that the people talk to us about how that would be worked out. And so I believe that it is wise to get some people here that say, these are the upcoming sports that we're going to want and we're going to go for. It's not just going to be a short distance. So what is in the future? And I know when I visited with Aaron up there, long distance shooting is a thing, and being able to be on the ground and running. And so topography and the land mass, we have to have that available. In order to have this as a shooting facility, I don't see it being just a closed campus. I see it as being something that is vast. And as far as inviting people that are skilled in the disciplines, yes, from the very beginning, I thought that we need to talk to people that do this, that have been part of, say, Whittington. I have been part of the NRA, have been part of different things that have experience to know, well, that looks good on paper, but factually, this is what would be going on, or these are the things, or the management. Down there in Cameo, we noticed how they shut off one area, and and made the other areas available, how they had that all scheduled, and it just ran so smoothly. And so those are all things that I believe that we do need to have. And as far as, we've noticed the last month, there's a lot of emotion in things. Well, people really like this, but I believe that we need to be more factual. What do we have? What do we want? And we're talking about the 5 sports we want to focus on. I thought we did do that. I thought we were talking about that. And as far as backstops, we've got to have backstops. If you're going to be shooting a mile down the road, you're not going to have things that you can depend on. We've got to have that topography. So, anyways, those are the things I had to say. Thanks, Kate, and I'm so looking forward to this. It's going to be awesome. So, thank you.
So I see we got co-chairman Washit on there, Art. Glad you finally could. We lost you in cyberspace, but it's good to see your face on the screen here.
Thank you. Better late than never. It's just, technology is not my thing, but glad to be with you today.
Well, join the crowd. So I'll just give you a real quick where we're at is just we were kind of going through items that kind of come up in the proposals, not anything specific, but different broad areas. And where we're kind of at now, I'm going to run through these real quick just to kind of get you, like Kate had brought up, topography is important. And then, we get into this acquisition and construction issues, and then the timeframes maybe are not going to line up. There was some discussion on the, federal lands, BLM, BORs, and then state lands. How does that work? Aaron brought up a kind of a governance funding structure stuff, but what we're really kind of working on now is that conversation that me and you have had about bringing in the right expertise. There was a suggestion that we utilize just as an initial screening tool, maybe to have Nephi and Cade and Judy and Aaron and anybody that's got people that are connected with some of the bigger shooting sports reach out and say, what would you look at in a facility? What are the most important attributes, and see if we could get just some input back on that as a screening. And then we talked about at some point in time, once we start to screen these down, is the conversation that me and you and I think Ron have had, is actually bringing in folks that actually do these large shooting events to help us, kind of select the last, if we get to the last 2 or 3 or 4 and have them take a look at them, maybe actually bring them into the state and do a couple of them and then help. How would we do a layout on a facility here to accommodate those folks? And then there was some discussion also about governance. But what I'd like to do is get back and ask the question. And Nephi, I don't know if he's might be listening, but for Cade and Judy and Aaron,
that's kind of where I wanted to jump in, if I could, real quick.
Okay, go ahead, Kate. Yeah.
So I hate to beat a dead horse because I kind of talked about this in the fall, but if we're going to eliminate people based off of some criteria that we're expecting to see for certain disciplines, it seems like we should provide that information with the RFP. And I think we could get there pretty quickly. I think Nephi could probably help us come up with, let's say, the 7 disciplines that attract the most shooters. And then we pick the 5 that we feel fit best within our ability to host in Wyoming. And then we get whether someone from the civilian marksmanship program, or I would prefer it to be someone without a vested interest in one of the community projects. So whether that's someone out of state or someone from a community that didn't submit a program, to say, okay, if you're going to do ELR, you have to have, like we had the 2,000 yard range line of sight with natural backstop. If you're going to do 3-gun, you need this many acres of this type of topography. If you're going to do like real general outlines, but if I'm writing an RFP, if I'm going to spend my community's money writing an RFP, and I'm going to be judged on 5 factors that you're going to tell me 3 months after I've submitted the RFP, that doesn't seem very like a best use of anyone's time. So I would propose that we do an accelerated timeline, maybe a subcommittee of a couple of people with industry connections. We come up with that narrowed list. We get back together for a quick meeting here in a couple of weeks to review that as part of the final RFP process and get that out initially.
So you would incorporate that in real quick, Kate, into the RFP is what you're saying with those topographical factors.
Yeah, some minimum standards.
Minimum, let's call it minimum standards.
And Mr. Chair, if I could jump in here, this is Nish with Game and Fish.
Yep.
I was going to say the same thing, like set up a criteria or a rubric or some kind of scoring thing and give it in advance to say, like, this is all the things, whether it's topography or the ease of land acquisition or whatever our concerns are overall, that we could also use after the fact to be able to say, this is why they were eliminated, unbiased manner, and this is how we scored the RFPs as they came through.
So let me ask you a question, and I know you guys didn't get the draft, and it's a rough draft RFP out there, but it kind of tried to do that, and particularly and I'm just going to use the long range example where it said you have to have line of sight for 2,000 yards and then a minimum of several hundred yards buffer on either side of that. And if you've got a parcel that doesn't facilitate that, is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I actually thought that was a good start to it, but how will that work in conjunction with, a skeet course or trap course, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are those different pieces? It's because it's not an either or. If we're trying to put 5 different disciplines on the same piece of property, giving them the guideline of like, okay, you have to have 100 acres that can have a shotgun area with a backstop that is not in that 2,000 yard line of sight range.
Yeah.
Like, what's your buffer? What's your layouts? And some of those are small. Some of them are large. Some of them are, one straight line. So it's a little easier to do if you're just trying to do a king of 2 mile, it's a whole different animal than a PRS or NRL where people are moving from station to station and changing what their backstop requirements are. Those things all kind of work in different areas. And so if we had those 5 chunks and said, these are the 5 things we're trying to accomplish on the same parcel, and this is roughly experts' opinion, how much space each of those need and how much space they need between them, that's a game changer for someone going out to look for land and understand what our requirements are going to be.
Can I have a follow-up on that real quick?
Go ahead, Aaron.
I think we've got to tread a very careful line on this, because if we take the ownership and responsibility to create the requirements and specifications, then we own it. I think a part of the strategy behind this RFP was to give them enough information directionally that they can be successful, but also give them an opportunity essentially to acquire and demonstrate that they have the expertise to put this together. So I think I agree with Cade that, like, giving them maybe a little bit more direction, and maybe we take it as far as saying, these are the top 5 shooting sports that we feel need to be accommodated. If you start getting into, okay, well, that needs to have this and this and this, are we really doing the state a service by potentially stilting their opportunity to go acquire that expertise and knowledge and demonstrate their capability of doing so? So, like, just a fine line, I would just suggest we want to be careful treading, that we don't own the outcome.
So let me ask a question here. It looks like looks like the way to handle that, and I would go back to Cade's thing. We're not saying you don't. We're just saying if you're going to include this, you have to have a minimum amount of acres to accomplish this type of thing. And to your point, Aaron, you may have a community come and say, we really want cowboy action stuff, and we need an arena and horse stalls and and corrals or whatever that is. And that might be something that's very important to one community that doesn't fit into the top 5. We need to maintain that level of flexibility. So the way we could potentially thread that would say, for these top 5 or these top disciplines, it would have a minimum requirement, but again, provide that creative opportunity and say, if you at the local level want to build in additional opportunities for these other type of activities, whether it's cowboy action sports or archery, a biathlon range for skiing in the wintertime, you need to build that into the structure and the location. Is there a way we can maintain that flexibility and opportunity at the local level, but yet provide some guidance that you really need to take into consideration, that there's a certain level of minimum type of things that we would like you to consider?
And Mr. Chairman, thinking about it a little bit more, we probably don't have to reinvent the wheel. If we picked the 5 top disciplines, whatever, there's guidelines out there. There's design standards for those guidelines that we could just point people to and say, here's the disciplines we expect to be included at this facility. Go to these design standards and make sure that you can meet those needs with your proposal.
Yeah, I like that idea. Just say, here's the disciplines. You need to figure out how that fits into your proposal. It's not limited to those, but these are the top 5 or the top 7, whatever that number is that we really think you should consider them. You need to incorporate that into your site. I think that even makes more sense. And then it gets back to Aaron's thing. They need to have their own expertise on how they're going to do some of this stuff, right?
Right. But at the same time, we've been telling these folks that the design of the range will come later and that the state will provide the experts to actually design the range. So I think we have to be careful not to stipulate that they have the plan in place. They've already designed the range and accommodated all these different disciplines into the geography, topography that they have available. We don't want to tell them they have to have the engineering and everything else done to design the range.
I don't think we're doing that, Art. We're just saying you need to consider these top 5 disciplines and go find out what that expertise maybe looks like. I think at the end of the day, we're still going to provide that expertise of the final design and layout, and it'll be a collaborative process. Roads, buildings, outbuildings, that stuff, that's part of that $10 million will be used to actually do some of the engineering, architectural, and some of the dirt work and the layout and some of that stuff. But I do think we need to at least give them an idea. This is what we think is pretty darn important to incorporate as far as the disciplines. And that was, remember the first thing we sent out and had people say, what do you want in a world-class shooting facility in Wyoming? I think we take that list back and say, here, we'll put out of here, and then look at working with Nephi and Judy and Cade and Aaron and these folks that live in this world. What are those top ones that we want an emphasis on? We're not telling them, but I think that very first thing we put out there is helpful in that aspect. Again, this isn't the final design, and this is just say, need to incorporate that into your concept. Many of those layouts that we saw, I think there was 2 or 3 that actually did conceptual layouts, already had much of that already in their plans. Some people have already conceptualized this is the type of shooting sports. I think we can accomplish that in the RFP with just a little guidance. What I would ask is so 2 things. I still think that, Kate, if you can just draft up some language to that. So take that existing So I'm going to jump a little bit ahead here. Take that existing RFP, and Judy, what I want, or Karen, what I'd like to do is make sure that we have a version that people can actually add their edits and write into in there, in that. And take that that's out there and provide those comments in those places you feel appropriate. And then I would still like to get back to this issue of is there stuff that Judy, with your expertise and the contacts that you have, could just provide some, what I would say, high level guidance for the type of facilities. Same thing with Cade and Aaron, and then we'll reach out to Nephi and say, just give us some guidance documents on what would constitute a really well laid out facility for your potential shooting sport. It just, and I think that will actually help us do maybe a little bit of screening. So there's two things in there. Everybody here needs to pick up that RFP, and we'll send out a non-write protected version, and then start including things that you want to see in there. And Kate, if you can try to talk about, just go in there and talk about those 5 disciplines and what you just, I'm trying to write and talk at the same time and run a meeting. I don't do a very good job of it, if you haven't noticed, particularly online meetings.
Judy has your hand up. Judy?
Pardon me? I don't have the ability to get a hand up here. Sorry.
Okay, I can see a hand. You apparently
Oh,
want.
okay. I
So
can't.
anyway, okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Yep.
I think what you, Cade, Aaron, everybody's been talking about the last few minutes. I really like that idea. I think it also speaks to the questions about governance, collaboration, whether it's a visitor center or local municipality, county, what have you. I think that when I was looking at the letters of interest, I just had these words on my mind when I would see about the different types of land and governance structures, and I was thinking about operations and maintenance, and because it's also got to be self-sustaining down the road, and with opportunities with private investment or whatever, and yeah, even at the least a letter of confirmation that a deal is feasible on whatever type of land being acquired is feasible in time for breaking ground and construction season 2025. So some of those details, and frankly, the words that popped in my head was we go from LOIs, trust us, to prove it kind of mode, if that makes sense. So that was what kind of was on my mind when I was going through that process. And I had another thought on the educational opportunities. Do we need to clearly define that more in the RFP, that is a requirement as part of your RFP, that in your governance structure and your plans for the facility, that it'll have, if it's year round, do we want it to be year round? Do we need an indoor facility there too for education? I think like Cameo had that. So those are some of the things that I was thinking of as I read through it.
Mr. Chair, that's something that Game and Fish is really, really heavily interested in and invested in. And that's one of the things that I noted when I went through all the letters and I talked to Director Nesbitt about, is that there was only a few that even referenced education in there. And so that is something that's really important for us.
And we need to call out the difference between education and training. I think we started seeing some, which I think the training piece of it's excellent as well. Some of the ability to do, additional, whether it's tactical training or coursework type things, but we don't want to confuse that with the true education piece, the hunter's ed piece. I spoke with some of the Game and Fish people at SHOT Show, and they're like, that's a non-negotiable for us, but I don't think that was ever communicated correctly. I don't think it was ever clarified. And so a lot of communities ran with the training side versus the education side.
Yeah, I'm curious, Nish, from a game and fish perspective, has there been any discussion or consideration given to some of the lands that have been identified in the letters of interest and what implications those have for particular seasonal ranges?
So, Josh, we haven't had that full talk. Like initially, like, we were just talking about going through, seeing where they were at, looking for wildlife concerns, habitat concerns, and then the education component. Those were the three big things for us. But talking about, in greater areas, we haven't gone there yet, but we could definitely.
Yeah, I'm sure that will be a factor at play at some point in this discussion. So
I guess I'm still a little concerned that there might be some of these other non-shooting characteristics that have to be addressed before we even think about putting a range someplace. Whether we're talking hotels, motels, restaurants, camping, all of those kinds of things. Where does that fit in terms of the priority? Do we have to have a certain base level of accommodations before we even think about building a shooting range there? Does that have to come first? And then we talk about, does the ground work for the shooting range? Or do we pick a place that has great ground and then figure out how we're going to house people and feed people at that location? Because there are different models out there, right? You look at Whittington Center, Raton, New Mexico doesn't have very many people there, not very many hotels. So they built housing as part of the complex. And that's going to add to your cost and so forth. But it's a model, it can work, right? So that's my question for the task force is, do these non-shooting things have to be addressed first as a primary criteria, or do we pick the shooting characteristics first and then figure out how we're going to do the rest of it?
yeah, I think Mr. Chairman, you bring up a very valid point on that. And I think I'm sure all of us have looked at these 8 letters of interest and have tried to rank them just on our own individual effort, just trying to be able to help in the conversation. But I mean, you look at the Campbell County facility, that's 140 miles away from the South Dakota State facility. And is that a viable option? I mean, I don't know how many other folks have tried to get to Yellowstone National Park, which I know is a major travel destination, but Cody certainly has lodging opportunities, but the availability of being able to book lodging in Cody is a real challenge. Those hotels are always full. So I think all of those parts of those components in consideration are certainly that's the challenge, I think, is how do we juggle all of these things, trying to prioritize one over the other, but they're all worth their own consideration of merit.
Mr. Chairman, if I could throw in, I mean, Aaron started a process of creating a matrix on how to weigh those things. And I wonder if we're putting the cart before the horse, maybe we actually focus on that matrix to figure out what our priorities are, the top 5 type of events. And if they have additional events, they get extra points of X, Y, and Z, lodging, camping, things to do, electricity, water, power, sewer, all those things. It seems like that would create the RFP versus us trying to make the RFP fit the matrix. Just a thought.
So if I'm going to jump in here, we're still on sawdust, folks. It's just the same conversation that we had, I believe, up in Cody, and we decided to look at a matrix, or not necessarily start a ranking schedule, but put the RFP out there and then screen these down. All this will start to, these discussions will start on each one. When we finally get that RFP back, that's just why it's important to get a good RFP, why we've already asked for motels, private camping spaces, RV hookups, proximity to airports, number of restaurants. All that will take into consideration when we start narrowing these down. But if we're back to, okay, how are we going to rank one over the other? we're back to where we started last year, halfway through this thing. Initially, we were going to put together a, you get X number of points for this, X number of points for that. And then, Aaron had brought up the concept of that he had submitted in I believe in November. And we're kind of going in circles here. And so how do we feel about incorporating as much information into the RFP as you possibly can? We've left room in there. So if we screen that down, that the task force can ask for additional information for clarification or verification of something, and then move it to the next level. So initially, when me and Art were working on this, we had 3 different levels of cut, and we felt you start working that time frame in there, and pretty soon, particularly for you folks in the private sector, you're going to spend the next 6 months doing this stuff. And so how do you want to do that? I thought we had agreed to go ahead and look at this kind of overall rank or system that Aaron had put together, and not back to individual ranking on how many motels, how close to an airport, and that component.
I feel like we're kind of at a
If I
hybrid
could-
point right now. So if we were going to do a matrix down to the nth degree, I think we needed to do that last year in Cody or somewhere in between. We're a little far down the line. But right now, what we're talking about is things that will eliminate people on the first round of the RFP. So at least giving them that framework. I don't think we have to say, if you don't have 97 hotel rooms within 30 miles with less than 60% occupancy, you're out. But letting people know what those, what the bold headlines are of things that will be judged on. And some of those are going to be, topography. Some of those are going to be, that one more cheeseburger, one more night factor, the couple of those different things, and say, here's the guidelines, the minimums. Tell us how you're going to meet those, and then we'll go from there. But you could see from the letters of interest we got that we got everything from, 2 pages of we're in to 233 pages of environmental impact studies. And so we just need to, the RFP should be a fairly standard thing. We should get back a pretty standard thing from everybody to judge each other against. And if there's something in there that they're going to be eliminated off of, now's the time to tell them that.
Mr.
I
Chairman?
guess that's,
Go ahead, Pepper.
Oh, thank you. And just to go back to this, the way I understood it, and maybe this is just a point of clarification, but when we sent out our task force letter for interest submission, we had categories of land and access and utilities, dining and lodging, economic development. All of those we gave to get information back. And the way I understood it was that we were going to look at what they had to offer and what they told us about those categories. And then we would see, okay, well, and as Kate just said, then that would give us the opportunity to look at the individual ones and say, okay, we see that you're not real strong here. Can you give us more information, or is this something you can overcome? That was kind of where I thought we were. So I don't believe that we're back starting all over. I think if we just continue on to the direction that we were headed, and add the priority skills that we want, or the priority events that we want to do, that we're doing good. I mean, maybe I just need clarification on that.
I think you're spot on. That letter was just to get people thinking about, so they had a leeway to start looking at some of those factors that were going to come into consideration, like utilities and land and topography and motels, airports, access. That was to say, start looking in this direction. Doesn't, these are the amenities that we're going to getting back to Kate's things, these are the things that will either move you up or down the scale. And I think some of those are in there already with some of the proposals that folks are thinking that line. So I think this just helps those folks that have already been engaged trying to develop this thing. That was the intent. Instead of just
Mr. Chairman.
Yep.
I'm curious because I think that at the top of that list is certainly the acquisition or the ability to acquisition those particular landscapes. Should that be something that maybe the chairs of this task force put forth back to those letters of interest to be able to provide some sort of accommodation of what that looks like? Because what you said at the beginning, if this is not going to be something that's going to be able to meet the time frame for potential construction, I mean, I think that's priority number one that we need to be able to determine is that land even available? And is it something that really continues to allow that application to move forward if it's not?
Well, and that was my thoughts exactly. Is some of these, I just don't see how you would move forward based on that criteria. And it was, this our very first meeting, we had this discussion about federal lands, and so I think that shows up in the RFP. I don't know at this point in time. I think we could probably go through a list of these, and maybe it's just me and the chairman based on the input that you guys have provided, and outline areas what I would call deficiencies in their initial letters, or do you just put the RFPs out there and say, here's what you have to deal with, and if you can't guarantee that there's land acquisition, whatever that be, perpetual easement, right of way, or outright ownership or lease can be completed in the next 18 months. You're just eliminated.
Right. I agree with that. I think we put a land acquisition plan in the RFP that they've already told us kind of what lands they're looking at. And we say, okay, give us the plan, give us letters of commitment, give us timelines on what it looks like from where you are on how much time is it going to take for you to get these lands. And I think another part of this is when we look at these state leases, and some of those leases will come to term maybe in the next 3 or 4 years, but there's a rancher on them now. Are we open to multiple use? Does the grazing lease conflict with the development of the range? And so we're going to have some tough questions to answer. We could find the ideal site, but there's a leasing issue for the next 2 years until that lease comes to fruition, right? So I think a land acquisition plan is spot on. We put that in right in the RFP. Give us your plan, give us letters of commitment, give us the timeline.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chairman, the challenge I could see with some of these communities having is how would they go about that process, or could it be eased in having someone through LSO or the state be able to help in being able to reach out? I can't imagine reaching out to the BLM or the Bureau of Reclamation if you're a committee of stakeholders, particularly seeing the group in the proposal letter of interest from Fremont County. Do they have the means to be able to get to a decision maker that will have those discussions with them, or does that need to be held, from the governor's office or somewhere else? I'm just trying to anticipate the realities of being able to try to provide something. Is that even feasible?
I agree. And I think even at the state level, if we're going to try and work with the Office of State Lands and Investment and so forth, if this is a real priority for us, who has the ability to leverage decision making? And it may not be, the local community that's trying to put the range together. And maybe it does need to be moved up into the political realm to try and resolve some of those.
Well, I'll speak to the state issue when we get through some of this other stuff, but because I've had a number of conversations even this morning with the Office of State Lands and Investment, and can walk through the process associated with that. And obviously that'll be something that has to be addressed for any land acquisition. But we need letters of commitments, and there's established processes for state lands to address these things. And we need to clarify that in the RFP. We're getting ahead of ourselves. We keep identifying issues, but we haven't resolved many of the ones that we've identified. I'd like to resolve some of these before we get, my list is getting longer and longer, and I don't have any answers. And so I'm going to back up again. So we're going to go backwards here just a little bit. I need a commitment from everybody that they will go into that draft RFP and mark that up. That's a commitment, and specifically for the agencies. James and Ron, we've talked about this with you guys, state parks. I would actually like you guys, particularly within your expertise, how do we incorporate the business plan? That's something that your staff will have to do, Ron, to say, here is the part of the RFP that deals with the development of a business plan. James, for the Office of Tourism, here's the part that needs to go in. And you guys will have to draft that up so we can insert this in there. This is the tourism plan associated with the facility. Dave, your expertise, you guys talked about, looking at how you guys do your RFPs, anything that state parks sees that we need in there from a recreational component. I need to have you do that. Same with game and fish, from an education. And then what do we need that you guys can put into this proposal? Same thing for every other of the private sector members on here and the other legislative members. I need a commitment from Judy. Can you talk to the folks and with your expertise, put together a high level things for the sports that you deal with as some potential screening criteria? What do you absolutely have to have? And the same question would be asked for Aaron and Cade. And we'll see if we can't Nephi. And the question on that is do you guys need to do this just as individuals and then get that information back? Or do you want to do a subcommittee and try to pull that together so you're not doing a duplicate effort? So,
I think we can work together without formalizing a subcommittee. Do you have any problem with that, Cade and Aaron? And Josh?
We all gave you thumbs up, Judy.
Okay, I saw that.
all right.
Yeah.
So if you guys need to get online, so we got Karen on here. She can set those up, online meetings if you guys need to get there, discuss. So LSO can help facilitate those discussions. And as you guys start to generate information, get that incorporated into the RFP.
Well, I think we should meet in person. So if LSO can provide a little stipend for us to all fly to Maui for this subcommittee meeting, that would be great.
Okay, we'll be here.
We can provide just stipend to Shoshone. That's Midway. Maui, Cade, I don't think so. I'd have to chair that subcommittee. And I'm not really fond of Maui. I was thinking more like Kauai or someplace like that. But anyway, yeah. But whatever we need to provide you guys, just let us know, and then we'll work with LSO. Even if it's an in-person, we've got money to, pay your travel and stuff to accomplish that.
I
If you
think
guys
we can
want,
handle it through some informal meetings and some quick onlines. So we'll reach out if we need any support, Karen.
Okay, so we've got those. Those are action items we've got down. I'll work on the land acquisition language. I do think we need to tighten that up. What I'd like to do is create this thing, and as you populate information into that RFP, just on a weekly basis, we'll just keep kicking that out for the next 3 or 4 weeks until we finally get, hopefully another month, that we can get down and have an actual final draft for the task force to review and crank out. Does that work? Is a month enough time? I don't see anybody shaking their head no.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if maybe Nish might want to work on the education and habitat impact piece. I think those are going to be important questions as well.
Yeah, and Nish, one of the issues on that I would ask you is on these draft proposals. If you can run that through the department, through those regions, and at least get their input back on any potential issues they see. I know there's one of them that's on designated crucial mule deer and elk winter range. That might be an issue for the department.
Mr. Chair, I already flagged that one, and there's another one with wetlands that gave me a little shudder. So I'll go ahead and I'll just go through those, and I have that for habitat, wildlife, and then education. And so I'll make sure we come back to you all with that.
Okay, thank you. All right. Where are we at?
So our deadline for submitting, getting this out to people right now is April 8th. So obviously we need to be done with our revisions before that or change our timeline.
Yeah, so how do you guys feel about that April 8th, that we'd have a meeting the week before to do any final reviews and changes to that? So that basically gives you 2 weeks. Does that work? Ron, James, how about your outfit?
Mr. Chairman, I'm actually gone for the next 2 weeks, but I can definitely try to get in there and update anything that we have. I have a couple things already written down, and I can address a couple of the tourism things as we go through this. I just wanted to get your points across first, but I do have a couple of points as I read through what I thought on some of the tourism side.
Okay, go ahead. You're talking about the overall of the 8 proposals.
Yep, just the overall, and I know that you were talking a little bit about the amenities and what keeps people around. One of the things that I had 2 thoughts on this. The one that one of the first ones is it's great to have the shooting range in a tourism hotspot. That's going to be a draw that's going to bring people in throughout that whole event. Maybe they'll bring families. They'll be able to go to some of those huge attractions. Some of the questions that I would ask, are they year-round attractions? Are they going to be seasonal? Maybe some visitation numbers, things like that. But then my other line of thinking was, so they go to those major hotspots and they come out and that's a huge draw. But would it be equal or maybe a little bit better to actually have it somewhere that's maybe not a major hotspot, that's a little lesser known? Because obviously we know that a lot of these folks are driving out to carry their guns. A lot of them camp. Would it be better to be the draw that, hey, we have a world-class shooting range, and then after or before you can do X, Y, and Z, whether it's national parks or other areas. That way, those hidden gems in those smaller areas, if they have the capacity, obviously with the lodging and the restaurants, that would be the first point. But if they had that, they're obviously going to hit that lesser known area first, and then they're going to go to those hot spots and take their families afterwards. So I'm a little torn on, I think it could go either way on that. To have it in a hot spot where they can go continuous and stay on a few more days. And obviously that's going to be a draw. No matter what, the tourism side of it, the world-class shooting range is going to be number one. The second one is going to be that tourism draw. If you bring a family, you're going to do it pre or post or during. So it's just a matter of if you want to have it in that hot spot where they're staying on a couple extra days, or do you want to have it in a lesser known area that they are going to put their money into that economy and then go up and do some of those hot spots either way. And I think a lot of that's going to be the pre and post work around the show. And that's where I would put something in there. If they have a destination marketing organization that's going to work with the shooting range, that says, this is what you're going to do. Here's a 5-day itinerary. Send that out to the possible participants beforehand and after, trying to get them hooked to bring their families, stay a couple extra days. I think that's where the real work on some of that tourism side is going to come into play. But I think either way that we cut it, whether it's a lesser known area or a hotspot, is going to benefit the state. It's just a matter if we want to pump money into those lesser known areas that can accommodate it.
So on that, James, that's where we need your expertise to come in and say, look, this is a destination marketing type thing. I think that is one of the criteria that we look at, whether it is a primary existing tourism or it's a destination and a little known. I think that's just one of many criterias we're going to have to evaluate. A lot of it will come back to the community and the site and the amenities. But if even to get them thinking about that, I think is helpful. So when you put together the, that should be two questions, right? Is this a existing tourism? What are you going to do to enhance the period of stay? If it's not a major tourism area and you're going to create a destination, what other attractions and stuff from a tourism standpoint? And one of the things that when we're going to evaluate these, I know that you guys do a good job at is you look at how they potentially track across the state. And you know what I mean? In other words, if you're heading to one corner and you're coming from the other, you're probably going to stop and spend some money in one place or another, getting to that destination type facility. But the more information that you can put into this RFP that help address those two issues, but I think we should identify those. There's two potential things in there. Let them tell us, instead of having an arbitrary criteria that we say, no, this is exactly what we want. I don't think we can do that until we look at all the other factors involved. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that makes perfect sense. And obviously we try to promote it throughout the year, is collaboration with the other communities as well. And some of those did mention it in their letter of intent, working obviously with Devil's Tower and a couple other areas. I did see that's also going to be key to this is working with the surrounding areas as well.
And on the tourism side, what I would hope we would come out of this, and this is not just strictly tourism, but the destinations. At some point in time, we need to get people thinking that this is a year-round facility. And what are those other activities that maybe in January you won't be out there doing, shooting it on the range? That what other activities or actions at a year-round type facility can they bring into it?
Mr.
Not wanting to throw water on this topic, but watching through the years, 8,000 to 10,000 people come into the national rifle matches at Camp Perry. There's darn few families that come with the shooters. The shooters are taking their guy type vacations, or the women shooters. There are not a lot of families that come because it's boring going and watching shooting matches. I mean, it's not something your people are dying to do. Down at Talladega, where we have 400 to 700 people come in for a match, I don't see a lot of families there. And if they are, they're going to want something to do while the shooters are shooting, because they have nothing else to do than sit around and wait. So I think that's a consideration that we need to look at.
So Judy, I would ask you, in a situation like that, based on your experiences, is that because they don't have those other activities for those family members?
Oh, no.
Or there's nothing in proximity like Yellowstone Park?
Well, then the family would go to Yellowstone Park while the shooter was shooting. Up at Camp Perry, you're right on Lake Erie. You've got all the fishing, the lake, everything's there. But the families tend not to come. The other thing is the motels are all filled up with, number one, shooters who book a year in advance to make sure they have a place to sleep. And secondly, the tourists fill in very quickly. So I think those are all considerations.
Well, when we get into that tourism plan, that's something to look at that with James too, is the nature of those. Any other thoughts on the tourism side?
Right. We need to look at activities for the family while the shooter's shooting.
Yeah.
Okay, then Aaron, do you see a lot of families come with folks to the big matches?
I don't actually do a lot of match shooting. We do a lot of training type stuff. And in Cody, I think we do a really good job of drawing people on vacation type trips. So from the training side of it, I do feel like we get pretty good family participation in, bringing people to Cody and creating another cheeseburger another night type event. So,
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
I would just say too, I think that Judy brought out a very good point as well as someone else there. When I worked in tourism, one of the things, speaking of Hawaii, that I did not send people on their first night after their hectic lives to Maui. I sent them to Honolulu to debrief a little bit and then on to the slower things. And what I will say also in favor of this is women are one of the markets that we want to make these things. There is a movement across the nation for archery. And so young people are getting very, very involved. I mean, there is thousands of people that go and attend these things, like in North Carolina and different places. And it's starting to build here, even in the elementary schools and stuff. And I see if there was a facility that they would sure, I see that as growing leaps and bounds, because it's sports that aren't just the basics of football and baseball. So that, and then also women in shooting competitions and things, that is really growing. So to have those multi-disciplines going on, and I see as a real advantage. And in a world-class shooting facility, we could accommodate all of that going on at the same times, and then have the evenings with the community or before and after. But I just see it as a growth thing with something that we are looking at like this, not just to build something in one little community, what can we do, but to look at it for this state. What can this state provide to bring in those people, but also those dollars? And I think it's exciting and something that we're right at a good time for all of this, because it's growing.
Yeah, as far as what I see as far as family participation versus independent participation, a lot of it tends to do with the type of match and I mostly attend archery matches, but we see some similar cross promotion on the shooting side. If it's a World Cup event where it's only the top 6 competitors in each category, typically they come in with their group of people, they shoot, they go home. But the big events like the Reading Shoot or the Indoor Nationals in Vegas, 3,000 competitors come and everybody in the family shoots. And so you've got the kids over on this line at 10, and then the adults over on this line at 12, and then the shoot-offs in the afternoon. And in between, they're out eating at all the restaurants and, going out and seeing what's in town for their one trip a year that they get to make out there. So part of that's going to be the type of events that we recruit and build for, because I see the same thing in the shooting side. It's a lot of the kids out there, their parents are participating in the adult shoots in the afternoon, and the kids are out on the line in the morning. So there is a tourism piece, obviously, in the before and after, but a lot of it's just going to be on the events that we're able to draw.
Yeah, and I've been to one of those total archery challenges, and you see a lot of young families. They typically camp out in those facilities when they have those competitions. At Big Sky or Park City, and so I think it's just the nature of the event, based on the conversation we've had here. Who's the target audience for those things? It may just be shooters on some of the other competitions. I do want to keep this thing moving. I'd like to go back to an overall arching thing. If there's something that you guys saw in the proposals, I went through and I didn't rank them. I just things that I really liked, and some that I didn't. I thought there was one that did a really good job of actually already identifying potential corporate partners. They listed a whole list of entities that they're having conversations with. I thought they did a really good job of researching the type of shooting sports. Other ones, proximity, Obviously some of them are closer to larger population centers, but is there anything else in just overall that we didn't capture, or something that you thought was really well that we need to put into the RFP? I really like the component in there where the one organization had identified a whole list of potential sponsors from this. Is that something that we would want to include in the RFP? Or just tell them you need to start looking at sponsors?
I mean, I think that's a governance thing. If you're looking for sponsors to make it long-term viable, then you can't just put in there, well, we hope to get some sponsors to pay for this in the future. You got to have some teeth to it. But if your governance is going to be a half-cent economic development tax that's going to pay for everything, sponsors become gravy, or it might just be, event sponsorship that's a little bit different. So I think that's kind of up to the communities to put in their governance and funding structure.
All right. Well, anybody else see anything else in there that we may want to capture in the RFP?
Mr. Chairman, I know we talked a little bit about it in January. I don't know if we want to put anything in there about emergency response. If you have an event like that with 600 people or more, what that would look like for their emergency response teams. That was one. And I did find it interesting, just a small piece, that some of them put in there the lighting in different sun. I don't know if that's a big thing. I would leave that up to Aaron and Kate and anybody that's worked on that. But I did find that interesting that they did say the amount of light that you get throughout the day and things like that.
So you just characterize that overall as emergency services, fire, police, ambulance, just something to take into consideration, the location of the facility.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's exactly what it would be. Because some of those look like they were a little ways out of town, and just to make sure that they had somebody on site or they had a plan for it. And I've seen it with other big events that they bring in special people. It's just something to think about.
Yeah, those ones that are half an hour out of town have to have a little more consideration than some. So that was the other thing that come up. Not only the topography, as I went through and I looked at the. I'd like to get the committee's thoughts on this, is the proximity. So there was a number of them that literally butt up next to the city limits in a couple of cases. And it seemed to me like that was probably a little bit close to, I'm afraid you're going to annoy a number of residents. I mean, there was one next to a subdivision, another one next to a state park, another one that runs right up to the city limits. Actually, there was two of them, I think, that run up to the city limits, maybe even three. What's you guys' thoughts on that? And particularly you guys that have shot at these facilities. It seems to me like that they're almost, a couple of them were actually maybe too close. Art, you got any thoughts on that? You're muted, Art.
So I don't know that that's as big a deal as long as we're clear on what we mean by buffer. I noticed in a couple of the proposals, their description of buffer was mostly about noise, right? The sound buffer. Where I'm thinking about buffer in terms of, will there be a subdivision that gets built 5 years from now that now makes part of the shooting range unusable or something? So I think we have to be really clear on that term of buffer, what we're talking about. And so if buffer is adequately accounted for, because even though it's next to a city limits, but it's a brownfield site or something that's not going to be developed, that's an adequate buffer. But I think we have to be really clear on that term buffer, because people weren't talking apples to apples.
Yeah, my concern is the level of noise that we go out and we start to build these things, and then 5 or 6 later, or a number of years later, everybody starts complaining about, all the noise associated at the range. but maybe that's a non-issue.
I think that's up to the communities to decide when they submit, and then that's part of our judging factor. If we've got two that are identical, in clout, but one's a little closer than we're psyched about, that can be one part of our judging. The other piece of it is, not all cities are created the same. There's a difference between adjacent city limits to Thermopolis and Cheyenne.
You say there's a higher tolerance for people and their neighbors shooting guns in one community versus another.
Probably.
Yeah, I would agree with that characterization.
The critical part on this, though, is if we are going to call somebody because of that, we have to let them know that piece. What you were saying, Kate, those things that we require, we need to put in there. One of the things we do within state parks is say, this is what's required for you to do, and this is authorized and what you can do. And maybe that's something we look at as we're editing this. Niche, I'm thinking of you specifically. What are the specific requirements that Game and Fish is going to have, and what would you prefer on top of that? So they know that if they don't hit these things, they're out. Because I think being close to a subdivision is a really good example. If we don't tell them up front, they may have chosen a different site if that was a high priority for us. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Mr. Chairman, this is Pepper. I would just say too that this is a great conversation because looking at noise and also closeness, one of the things that we see sometimes is where an entity will go ahead and build something and find out maybe that, oh my goodness, this is set in the master plan for development, or the noise factor. And I think it goes back to keeping it just in mind that would help with the topography. The other thing is we don't want these communities to put in proposals, letters of intent, and then proposals where they're going to have a bunch of public pushback and meetings and just a terrible thing that could just ruin it. So for them to be able to consider it on the front end, I think is just a good reminder of these are two things that could make or break the success of something like this.
I like the concept of these are required and these may be, just take under considerations. You're just going to have some things built into these things like the backstops. It's, if you got a natural one, but even the distance, I just can't imagine somebody wanting, shooting 50 caliber a quarter mile from their house. I'm just telling you, the suppressors, unless you got a suppressor on those things, you're going to hear them 3 miles away. But anyway, any other things that people have captured or want to on associated with these letters of intent?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think the one thing that maybe needs to be reiterated in the RFP would be, we had asked in these letters of interest to give some sort of historical data or trends on weather, and a lot of those were missing. I think also orientation is going to be key on this. So I think those just need to be highlighted to be of significance.
Yeah, and I think I've got that orientation stuff in the draft already, but I'll take a look at it and make sure that. And I did notice there was a number of proposals that did pick up on that and said, the bays are going to be oriented north or south. But yeah, we can highlight that, Josh. Anything, the weather, what's historical weather in Wyoming, Josh? Could you explain what that is to me? I mean, what do you look? You're muted. What specifically are you looking at?
Well, I had because we had indicated that before, I had reached out to Don Day to try to indicate, how would you look at that on various proposals? And so I got some rankings, particularly with wind, but he actually was able to provide average rain, average snow, humidity. But I think the wind ranking was probably the most critical component to be looked at.
So we have really windy and we have windy places in Wyoming. I'm not sure if there's not any place. Anyway, well, we can put something in there and ask them for just, historical, or average, I guess, would be weather conditions, right?
Right.
All right. Anything else anybody saw or in those that we'd want to include? All right. So, if we're done with that, so back to the land issue, and I've talked to the Office of State Lands and Investments, and if they're not other institution lands, most of the ground that's being looked at is school trust lands. Yeah, and under that, they're not necessarily, quote, state lands. They have a specific purpose under our Constitution, and that's to generate revenue for the public school system. So even if you've got a proposal on state lands, there's a couple options. If a local community, and I'm not even going to get into the permittee issue right now, that community is still going to have to lease those lands at a comparable rate that they would any other property. They have to generate revenue for the school trust. Long term, even if it's school land, we probably need to look at acquisition, depending on who the final entity that's the owner and the governance of the structure. So even if, let's say we had 3,000 acres of school trust lands, we were going to put a facility in, that would still require an annual lease payment by the state shooting complex back to the school foundation program to lease those lands for that purposes. So that's how the school lands are going to work. It would be different if it was game and fish or state parks owned lands. We didn't get any. I think there was one that mentioned there might be a small parcel of state parks land in there. Those have a different consideration because they're owned for different purposes. So then dealing with the issue of existing leases on state lands, and what may not even just be agriculture, you could have gravel pits or surface mining pit. Those arrangements are typically negotiated between the other permittees. And so in a case like this, if you have a community that's contemplating, the first thing they would do would go out would be to potentially approach that, let's just say, grazing leasee and say, is there a way that we can acquire or offset? And they typically will pay a compensation level for a reduction of those utilizations. So even in a case like that, you would go out there and say, look, we want to use half of this parcel for a state shooting complex. You would have to negotiate a price to acquire the rights of that parcel of ground from that surface leasee. That could be on an annual basis, or it could be a permanent transfer of that leasing rights. It says all along we've always, so grazing is a compatible use. It may not be right around the buildings and the parking lot, but on the ranges, but it would potentially take a change of season of use. I'm just familiar, we have this place called Camp Guernsey where they shoot howitzers up there all the time, and they graze all of that stuff at Camp Guernsey. It actually helps suppress the fires, keeping the fine fuels down. So again, that would be something that local entity would have to work with those state leasees to basically say, we're going to modify the grazing. It may take additional fencings or improvement to manage that in conjunction with the state shooting range. There may be certain times of the year that you just shut part of a range down for 2 or 3 weeks and allow grazing operation to go, or it can be at a low time of the year. But those are all discussions that those local entities need to have with those surface leasees. At the end of the day, long term, it's still going to probably result in either a long-term lease, or the state shooting complex would actually acquire those lands in the name of another entity. It may be state parks, maybe game and fish, it may be the county, it may be the municipality, but one way or another, long-term best safe scenario, even for those state school trust lands, is to do an acquisition. And so I will put more language into the RFP associated with that. But it's a process. It doesn't mean that we can't use those, but the first process is to go out and first try to work with those surface leases after we've identified an area, whether they'd be willing to give up part of that lease. That's a negotiated price. There is a fallback mechanism that the state has that they can do some valuation on those in a scenario where you have parties that can't work. Ultimately, that decision would result with the SLIB board, the top 5 electeds. So that's specific to state lands. And so we are still looking at a potential lease acquisition even on state lands. So anybody have any questions on that?
I think that's been pointed out as a pretty big concern, because I don't think that the negotiations to take over a piece of state property are going to go very well in any situation. And I think it's the most likely, most affordable way for us to get a facility. Because if we have to buy the land, this doesn't happen. We don't have near enough money. Accessing state lands, we can do something that's really good. I don't think those negotiations are going to go over well. Maybe some help from this committee in a way to do that, or a mechanism to facilitate that, would be helpful.
So one of the options there that could potentially be discussed would be some land swaps with state lands and private lands to help facilitate some of those discussions. Obviously, there's a number of scenarios that when you look at different state lands, it's neither conducive for the state to manage those, neither for the leasee, where they could block some of that stuff up. But again, that starts to run that, those typical type of swaps take a year or two at the very quickest to get those things done. And so, but there is some other potential options there, Aaron, as far as those discussions, as far as looking at some trades, but ultimately that trade still results in some potential acquisition or leasing. You could actually enter into a long-term, lease with some private lands for one of these would be a considered option. If you get a 50-year option with a renewable clause, or, an index to CPI for lease rates, or that's an option to actually go out and lease private property, or even, again, back to school trust lands. If you didn't want to acquire them, it's still going to require an annual lease payment. And they've got a methodology that they do that for these, for non-agriculture and non-mining leases, that they'll go through a formula and calculate what that lease would be. So one way or another, there's still expenditures, even though you're on state land. You're going to end up either leasing or a long-term acquisition proposition. To facilitate that other one, there could be some, if the permittee is not interested in having some type of dual use out there, would be to look at some land swaps and then acquire those once the state acquires that private property in lieu of an exchange in it. So there's some options out there. It's complicated, but it's feasible. Initially, I think the way we would look at these is probably try to work something out with the existing leasees, and then do a lease option with the Office of State Lands and Investment for those to get the facility up and going. Any questions on the use of state lands? Keep coming back. Land is expensive, but sometimes the type of land that we are looking at are not necessarily the most conducive for what other people would be looking at from a standpoint of either development or industrial. Even some of the type of lands we're looking for are not highly valuable for grazing operations. They just don't have a lot of AUMs out there because they're too steep, too rocky, too much alkali, not a lot of grass. So some of the things that we're looking for attributes wise are not necessarily would be a high priority for somebody to acquire, to build a house on. or even run a grazing operation. All right.
Mr.
Anything
Chairman,
else on the land issue?
Mr. Chairman, real quickly, that was a good point. And another thing, seems like there's always like the dominoes fall. You talk about state acquisition opportunities, and then there could be low price land that requires a big infrastructure expense, or higher price land without, a lot of expense. It might be able to, there's a vicinity maybe to tap into some of that infrastructure and lower the cost. But anyway, I don't know if I really have a point there, but there is a, yeah.
There's
Cost
a
limit is
development
one
cost
thing.
associated with the land acquisition.
Yeah.
Well, and about half of the letters of interest had come up with their own solutions for this already by using county lands that they already have letters of interest or letters of commitment on. And so if we make that part of the RFP and at least just kind of specify again, the, less you have to spend on land and infrastructure, the more you can spend on the world-class facility. And what does that look like? And just, maybe lead the horse a little bit more to water on some of those conversations to go back and look harder at being creative.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, Kate. This is a first cut. I do think in a number of cases, you do have, one proposal, they own all the land. So that's really a non-issue from a standpoint there, is they own that property. And then there's another one that had some joint ownership that had some opportunities there too. So there's going to be variables out there, but I think a number of these need to go back and look at land values, or what that lease would look like, doing a long-term lease even on those state lands.
Mr. Chairman, it's Pepper. One thing with some of the land, because some of it's just beautiful, but should we know about what the DEQ and different things, if there's any hazardous things on these lands or issues that are going to have to be dealt with? I think a couple of them have been dealing with some things or still have some things to deal with. So if that's going to be an issue, should they look into that during this time and find out what that answer might be?
Yeah, I think you're going to have to rely a little bit on that local knowledge. I certainly don't want to involve a regulatory agency at this point in time. I think that lays back. Those local entities should know, they should know whether there's any potential, what I would say, prohibitory toxic problems associated with the parcel of land. Finally, obviously, before you'd ever get to construction, you would have to have some type of evaluation to make sure.
I think that's a pretty simple line in the RFP. It says, are there any known environmental or what's the one where the heritage, where you do the cultural impacts on this land, with a note that says that it'll have to pass these tests, and even if you're selected, it could be disqualified at a later date if these are found.
Yeah, I think you just put that in there as an FYI, right? You need to understand that it's an escape clause, that if you come out there and find out that somebody's buried a whole bunch of asbestos right in the middle of it, that you're probably not going to do that.
Yeah, environmental and archaeological impacts, because
we don't want to have anything to do with archaeologists. We're going to be shooting all them bows and arrows out there, and they'll be claiming them as cultural sites.
Hey, be careful. That's my agency, darn it.
Yeah, I need to visit with you about that someday. Anyway, what I'd like to do now is just, we've talked about it a little bit, would be just to run through that draft RFP. Um, Karen, is there any way to pull that up on the screen?
Yes, I'll grab it and I'll bring it up here shortly.
Can you enlarge that a little bit, Karen? Perfect. Can everybody see that? Or is it too big now?
Too big.
How about that?
Great.
So one of the things that we tried to do with the preamble in there is just give people a little bit of background information, you know, how the early participation, but to also just give them that it's a little bigger than just a shooting range. And I probably should have included some language in there about educational opportunities, but you know, if the right facility was there, we would obviously want to have a multiple year build out. So again, I'm not going to read this to you. You guys can read through it. What I would hope to do is we can get you a not a right protected document, and you guys mark this up. There's absolutely no pride of authorship in this whatsoever. We need to get everybody's input in there. One of the things that I would like to do is we have encouraged in the past for people to contact members of the task force in your local or regional, or particularly if you got agency issues, you know, how do we develop our tourism plan, business plan, educational outreach with game and fish, or how would it integrate in with something state parks? We need to add for each one of you agency folks in there, who's going to be the primary contact with the phone numbers and emails. That if we can, one of the things that I wanted to, more than important is the substance of this right now. Everybody can mark this up, but I wanted to go to the bottom, Karen, and just talk about the time frame. If you can scroll all the way to the very end. So this is where we need to get you guys' input in. This after the conversations we've had today, it may be a little too aggressive, but I just want to walk through this that by April 8th, which is about 3 weeks out, that we would have the RFP available on LSO's website. By June 3rd, that gives them just under 2 months to get this back to LSO. And then on June 10th, we'd have LSO summarize the initial rankings by the committee. In other words, what I had anticipated there, that would give you a week to go through those and just kind of get what you think is the number one proposal, number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and just rank them in order, and then get your proposed ranking back to LSO. Use that proposed ranking system that Aaron had drafted up, just for an initial, and then we can look at those. Once the LSO has summarized those, and everybody we'll have a side-by-side spreadsheet where it'll show everybody on there what your number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5 is. And then actually have a task force executive session sometime after we get that initial ranking back between the 12th and the 14th to review. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd recommend maybe we think about putting in the RFP kind of a matrix where we would ask the submitter to populate the fields, because we're going to get a wide array of stuff. But if we could, have boxes that said number of hotel rooms, number of campgrounds, distance to the airport, those kinds of criteria, but then have them fill out the box. And then LSO would be able to take those boxes and put them all side by side. And so wherever possible, we would be able to do fairly quick comparisons for all 8 submissions. If we don't do that, then LSO or us individually are going to have to go through those narratives and extract that detail to try and create that. But if we had the submitter populate many of those fields, it'd make it easier, I think, for us to quickly do some side-by-side comparison.
So how do you view that? That's what the RFP, you should be able to go up there and say specifically in the RFP where it says, how many camping spots, how many motels, how many restaurants within that RFP. So I'm not tracking with you, Art, is exactly what you say. Then they populate that box.
Right.
They've already said what they have.
But just looking at these letters of interest, people have said that information in different ways, right? So one place might say, well, we're an hour and a half from the airport. Another one says we're 150 miles from the airport. One says we have a large number of restaurants. One says we have 23 sit downs for fast food. I'm just thinking, when the language in the RFP is typically going to be a paragraph as opposed to a box. And so when they write a paragraph, somebody's still going to have to go in there and extract that detail out of the paragraph and then put it into a side-by-side comparison sheet. It just seems to me it'd be expedient if to the greatest extent possible, we had the submitters put that information in a side-by-side, easily compared type of box as opposed to just a narrative.
So I need more explanation. I'm still not tracking. So you're saying check the box if you have 50 restaurants, check the box if you have 100 restaurants, or just a box and we have X number of restaurants?
Yeah, I think you have a box of number of restaurants, 50, number of hotel rooms, 2,000, right? So they're putting numbers in there, and it may not be easy. They said, well, right now we have 2,000, but there's 2 hotels that are being built. And so next year we're going to have, 2,200. But to the greatest extent possible, if they put a number in the box, rather than just giving us a long narrative, it may be easier for us to make those comparisons. Maybe not.
I don't have a strong disposition one way or another. I guess I'd open it up, see what other people thought. Because if you're doing that, Art, I'm assuming you want to do that for, how many miles? Do we just want to break that into, again, 4 boxes, less than 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30? Or you just say right there, tell us how many miles to the facilities, like some of them have done in their letters of intent.
Right. But some of them say, well, for 30% of our hotels, we're within 2 miles of the range. And others say, well, the rest of these, we've got hotels over in another community that are, within driving distance, but they're still 60 miles away. So I don't know. It just seemed to me that when we're trying to do the comparisons, when I laid these letters of interest side by side and tried to compare apples to apples, I found it a little difficult to find the exact information to allow me to compare community 1 with community 2.
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation when it comes to the letters of intent. So I'm just trying to think of the mechanics of how we're going to do that for each single criteria, because then it's back to, how far to the natural gas, how far to power, how many miles of road. I mean, how detailed do you want to get in this thing?
So some of the letters, right, they said, utilities are close. Well, what's close, right? When you're paying thousands of dollars a mile to run utilities, how close is close? So maybe Business Council and other places already have an ability to quickly gather that type of information. I'm not sure.
Cade, you had something?
I did. I just wanted to, because I feel like we're having the same conversation that we had in
Riverton.
Riverton and in Cody, that we had to pick a fork in the road, and I feel like we had to pick the fork in the road 6 months ago. And that fork was, were we going to be hyper specific, or were we going to let them present in their own format? So I think 2 weeks to completely grid the design. I think we could make some call outs, like, how many restaurants, wherever we talk about the restaurants in that RFP, and like express in miles, right? Or everything should be done in miles, not hours, because I probably drive faster than some and slower than others. And so drive times are not super relevant. Miles usually are kind of uniform. The Office of Tourism probably has some standard boilerplate number things that they have for hotel rooms and capacities and all that. And so we could just express this in, available beds or whatever tourism's is. So everyone's using kind of a standardized thing without us having to basically create a 10-page Excel document that they have to fill in every document. So at least we're getting information back in a uniform level, but we're not trying to create this massive spreadsheet over the next 2 weeks.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah,
I think we could easily do it. Just pick a mile distance within 25 miles. How many campgrounds? How many hotels? How many restaurants? Whatever that number is, I'm making up that number. But then you're comparing apples to apples too, which I think is pretty important in this RFP.
Yeah, and I think as the narrative that works, I'm Art, I'm a little bit with Cade to go back and try to create that spreadsheet at this point in time in the next 2 weeks. I don't know whether we've got the time to do that. But I think, like Dave said, you can just say, list the number of facilities within whatever, 10 and 30 miles of or within the facility, and to break it up that way. But I just don't know how we're going to put together a spreadsheet with all these check the boxes at this point in time. It's a time constraint. Would that work, Art, to do something to try to narrow it down in a narrative to accomplish what you want to do?
Yeah, I think some standardized thing. I like Dave's approach. I think some standardization would help.
Yeah.
But we'll still have to, read them out and pull information out of a paragraph, which is slow. But it's probably the best approach at this time.
Okay, let's get back to the calendar if we can. So question on those first three events, if we've got this thing ready to go by April 8th, and so that's an internal, that's for us, that's a target for us. When the RFP goes out, so if we ended up and it took a few days longer, but then every day we take longer, we have to shift everything down the list. And we've kind of left a little bit of time on the end of here, but particularly for folks with agencies and, all of us that have to work other jobs in the private sector, folks, we tried to be cognizant of not taking up your entire summer with this, but it's if we're going to move this thing, it's pretty tight timeline. So we get June 10th, LSO would just provide a summary sheet of our initial rankings, and then sometime that week of June 12th to the 14th, we'll have an executive session, and it's probably an all-day deal to get through 9 applications after we've looked at the rankings. and screen which ones we want to bring in for a formal presentation. So that week of June 12th or 14th, that's your first screening tool as to whether you want to bring them all in, or you want to bring half of them in, or you want to bring 3 of them. And then once we've made that determination, we'd notify those applicants, and then within 2 weeks, we would set up that week, try to set up time for oral presentations, limited to 2 hours per applicant. So if you got 5, you're talking 10 hours. So, you're looking at either one really long day by the time you take an hour lunch break, or you schedule that for 2 days. That'll be a decision of the task force. And then we would, after we screen those, and we'd further select them after the oral presentations, send any information after that right back to those that we wanted to go ahead and schedule a site visit with. So we've screened that. Now we're at 2 screenings, and now we're down to scheduling site visits with these folks. We try to do that during that 2-week period in the middle of July to do that and then we would meet sometime that middle of August to make our final decision and selection. And then we send that on to the committees to go ahead and draft the legislation. What's your guys' thoughts on that time frame? Is that too compressed? We can move that all the way back to, I think we have to have a recommendation, I want to say by October, I believe, in the original legislation.
Yep, that's correct.
But I know everybody gets a little busy. Well, people are busy at different times of the year. Is this a realistic time frame? I'm just going to go down the list and ask, folks, what do you think? Aaron?
I'm just thankful that I don't have to do any of the work to submit.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's manageable. It's the more we push back when the RFP is available to the communities, the more pushback I think we'll get, just because that's already under 60 days now. I think we said 45 was the minimum, 60 would be ideal.
Yeah.
Right there in that window, but everything else seems doable.
Well, we could change that due date back maybe and shift it if we need to, a week, to give them another week. But unless you guys have strong feelings or if it comes down to it, we're going to have to start scheduling these meetings and stuff so everybody can get it on their calendars too. And so the more we keep moving that stuff back, but we've got about 30 days on the back end. We can move this stuff down if it works better for you guys. Josh?
I think it's going to be tight, but I think it's manageable. And I think once it's established, then we'll just move forward, and we'll just have these as the dates that we know are set, and we'll accommodate accordingly.
Mr. Chairman, I echo Josh. It's tight, but they have done the LOIs, and I'm sure everyone's listening to this meeting, and they'll know they'll get an RFP and kind of what's going to be in it. And for our purposes, I think you're right. I mean, we're heading into the summer, and the more we add a week or extrapolate things, then you just kind of get into the dog days of summer. And it seems like if you just have this tight but doable schedule, you're on track, and we get it done, and we're not running into, oh, can we move this date because we can't get half the people to join us.
All right, anybody else want to weigh in?
Mr.
No,
Chairman.
excuse
Go
me,
ahead.
go ahead. I think this is manageable, it's tight, and at some point, a number are going to percolate to the top, and we won't be dealing with 8 or 9 applications. We'll be looking at 2 or 3, and that will make a substantial difference.
Yeah, I think I think you're exactly right, Judy. As this thing starts to move through the summer, it's going to take less and less time. I would hope we don't end up with 5 or 6 site visits. I hope that we start to narrow it down by that time, because the site visits and additional, meetings with the sponsors, if that's only 2 or 3, that could all happen in a 3-day period instead of 2 full weeks. So it should start to speed up after we start to screen them out.
Mr. Chairman, I would say that it is tight, but with interim and everything like that coming up and people making obligations and things, it's nice to have some dates in place. Also, I was wondering, when we do the site visits, and maybe I missed what you just said, would we plan to do 2 or 3 of them at a time, or would it be on weekends, or do you have an idea of what that might look like?
Well, most likely that's so those are going to be by the time you travel, because these are scattered from Cheyenne to Cody, from every corner of the state, and you very well may half a day to travel, and then a half a day site visit and meeting with the proponents of the project again, and then another half a day. So if you do 3, you're looking at potentially, let's just say we screened it to 3 for site visits, you're looking at 6 days by the time if they're extreme distances. Now, if it was something like Fremont County and Hot Springs, you might be able to knock 2 out in 1 day. But if you got to go from Gillette to Evanston, or Cheyenne to Cody, I think you just better figure 2 days with travel time to do each one, and hopefully that there's some efficiency in there or not. But that's why we've scheduled, during a 2-week period, I would anticipate upwards of 6 days that it may take to do just 3 site visits, depending on, where they're at. Maybe it only takes 3 or 4, but I think it's going to take at least 4 if we screen it down to 3.
Okay, so the site visits will all be scheduled between the July 8th and 19th, so we know that block it could well be used, and to try and schedule around that.
Correct.
Okay, so LSO can also use that.
Yeah, until we actually screen those on the, so after the oral presentations on the 24th to the 28th of June, 3 weeks later, we'll be scheduling those site visits, but I try to keep those 2 weeks free. And I'm very cognizant, not every member of the task force is probably going to be able to make every single meeting, so, but to the extent possible, this gives us, try to maintain some flexibility in your calendars, and then we'll work around that. I just wanted to leave a 2-week block there to maximize the ability for as many people to participate as possible.
Mr.
Any other thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, RFP process never take the amount of time you think they're going to take. They take a lot longer, even if we're focused on it. So I like that you actually have a month on the back end to be able to be flexible. I think that makes sense. I don't know if it's the case going through this process. I know for an agency to go through an RFP process has to be approved by the AG's office, and that could take up to 2 or 3 weeks itself. And I don't know if that's the case. Maybe Karen knows whether we have to do that or if you do. But I love that you have some room on the back end, because this timeline will get blown out of the water, and we'll just have to reassess as we go through. So I like the tight timeline.
Yeah, so for this RFP, this is because the way this is structured, Dave, the only thing we're going to do is we're going to make a recommendation. It's not a contractual. So there's no involvement from the AG's office. And at the end of the day, we get all the way through this. So we're going to make a recommendation back to the legislature and the governor. So it's not a contract at that point in time.
Thank you.
That makes sense?
Yes, sir.
All right.
So one thing on that calendar that we just had up, we've talked about the elimination dates. They're kind of soft the way they're worded in that calendar. I just think we should be clear that at that 12th to 14th of June, the screen applicants for formal presentation, that we're only the only presentations we're going to get orally, my understanding was that we're going to possibly filter out a couple. All 8 could do it, or all 9 now, or some could be eliminated there, and then oral presentations we eliminate again, and then site visits. Or is it your vision that we hear oral from everybody before eliminating?
We talked about that. So I don't want to hear presentations from everybody if it looks like somebody just threw something together and there's just no possibility. In other words, it's not fair to them to lead them along if it's just obviously they just can't meet the criteria or what we're looking for. At that point in time, we don't hear an oral presentation. So there's really 3 points of, that initial ranking and executive session. We're going to say, how many do you want to move on for oral presentations? We do the oral presentation. How many do you want to move on to site visits? And so I can strengthen that language and say only those selected.
Yeah. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I just think we need to communicate that so people know they're getting cut. They have the potential to get cut 2 weeks after they submit an RFP.
And Mr. Chairman, the only other thing I would throw out, and I know we don't need it on this calendar, Aaron did a great job starting the concept of the matrix. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion around that as far as what topics will go in that matrix a little bit too. So I think we're going to end up having to do a little work between April 8th and June 10th to make sure we're kind of all agreeing on that piece of that.
Yeah, so that would be another to take a look at that, and before we actually get together and screen those, that we need to refine that stuff that Aaron put out. That's what you're thinking, Dave?
Yes, sir.
I'm also thinking, Senator, that we can take some pictures and video perhaps during site visits, and if 1 or 2 members can't make it to a particular site, we can share that, and so you get a sense of what the place looks like and offset the disadvantage if somebody can't make it to one of the visits.
Mr. Chairman, just make sure I'm reading it right. There's the July 3rd deadline for the request for additional information from the task force to the applicants.
Yeah, in other words, if there's something that we see that it's not clear, or you didn't discuss this, there's an omission there, it looks good, that's what we would say, look, when we do the site visits and stuff, you better be able to answer these questions, right? If it's either just an omission or clarification, that's the intent there, is to provide that flexibility for both us and them.
Yeah. And I guess the next step, I was wondering, and we'd be able to get that on the site visits. That makes
At the
sense.
site visit, yeah.
And did you want you asked for some of the agency, everybody's input on the draft RFP.
Absolutely.
Was the deadline April 1st, or did you give a deadline?
What's that again, Ron?
It was the deadline, did I hear it right? April 1st to get that? Well, we want to issue the 8th.
Oh, no, what I would like to do is that we have our stuff available by the week before. Everybody's got their stuff. And then what I'd like to do is get back together one more time and just walk through the entire thing before we put it out there, and then give staff, 4 or 5 days to make any corrections. So I believe that's on a Monday. So we'd want to meet the previous Monday, set up a Zoom call like this and just walk through that final draft to make sure that there's no acts of omission or anything that we've missed.
Okay, thanks.
And I think that's the same time we would want to go back and look at Aaron's potential ranking criteria as another look and see if there's anything there. We have time because we won't actually be ranking those for 2 months. Maybe we ought to just focus at this point in time on the RFP, but we'll try to get something out that week before. I don't have my calendar with me, but we're looking at probably sometime around April 1st or March 29th to try to get back to go over that RFP. What's that look like, Karen? Do you have a calendar?
I do, but
29th is
unfortunately I
Friday.
can't pop it up on the screen. You're looking at, you've got, working backwards from April 8th, that being a Monday. The previous Monday is the 1st. The previous Monday is the 25th of March.
April 1st would be that next Monday before April 8th. That gives everybody 2 weeks to take another run at this. Is that enough time? Yay, nay? Silence is unanimous that
Mr. Chairman, that's the Monday after Easter, but I think with 2 weeks and everybody knowing ahead of time that would be good. That would work. That would work. When we have a deadline, we just meet it, right?
So let's schedule that then for April 1st. See what we've got then, and if we need to make any further clarifications or changes to the RFP at that point in time, formatting or whatever we need. You guys have a preference on a time? Morning or afternoon?
Mid-morning.
Mid-morning, 9 o'clock? Gonna say, depending on what time you get up, Kate, that could be like 7 o'clock in the morning for some of us. 9 o'clock? All right, 9 o'clock, April 1st, to get back and review the RFP again.
Mr. Chairman, I know I mentioned it earlier, but I'll be gone until the 3rd and won't be able to make that call, but I will get all my things into the RFP and happy to answer any questions when I get back. If that's okay.
Well, you have good fun on your trip. Hopefully you can get something done over there. So,
Hoping so.
all right.
Thank you.
Karen, can you get that scheduled? And we'll just do another online meeting for April 1st at 9 a.m.
I would be happy to do that for you. I just want to let you know that you do have a conflict with Management Council at 8:30 that morning.
That's a good point.
And I do as well. I think I'm a little later that day.
On April 1st.
I don't know
I'd be
exactly
more than
when the
happy to
interim
skip
topics
management.
will.
Yeah, normally I would skip Management Council, but we've got to do interim topics that day.
Correct.
How about April 2nd, 9 a.m.?
That's
I can
better
make
for
that
me.
work.
All right, let's do April 2nd, that Tuesday.
Mr. Chairman, I'll go ahead and set that up for April 2nd at 9 a.m.
Thanks for taking care of me, Karen.
I'll be traveling that day, but I'll try to see if I can get on.
Okay, and Judy, if you can't get on, if you can just get, if you get a chance to review that,
Absolutely.
get any comments, even if it's after April 2nd, into us.
Well, I think Kate, Josh, and Aaron and I are going to put in some time together before then, and we'll be good.
Okay. Anything else good for the team?
I was just gonna
Contact
ask-
information. Judy. I think I've got Cade's. Maybe, does somebody have everybody's that could share everybody else's?
I don't think, at least I've never received a list of everybody's contact information.
Can you send that back out, Karen?
Yes, I can send a list out with everyone's contact information.
Thank you.
And Judy, I'd encourage you to make sure you get Nephi in the loop on that,
Yep.
shooting criteria.
He's actually already
he's
sent
already
an email to
yeah.
Judy and me and Aaron. He's listening in as we speak.
Mr. Chairman, would it be worth, I don't know, Karen would be the one to tell us, but a document where we can see each other's edits as we're working through this versus waiting till the last minute, that we could actually kind of weigh in as we go through something as Google Docs or something else?
Great.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Glenn, as soon as we conclude this meeting, I will be working with our IT department to see if we can set up a shared SharePoint site so that you can all access documents, as well as use that throughout the interim in order to, as Co-Chairman Washit said, upload photos and videos and things like that, so that you can keep it as a working document throughout the summer and a working site. So I will be working with our IT department to make sure that we can get you those capabilities.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else? All right. I'm going to call this meeting adjourned. I appreciate you guys. This is a lot of work. You know, we're baking this cake as we're adding as we go. So it's a creation. Hopefully we don't end up with Frankenstein by the time we're all done with this thing. So anyway, any other closing comments? Art, you have anything you want to add?
No, I think we're making progress, and I know that it gets frustrating when we revisit some of the ground that we already talked about, but I think that's good and wholesome for us to make sure we're comfortable with the approach we're taking. And sometimes it means we have to go back and say, what about? Maybe we should. And now I think, after banging away at this thing for a while, we're starting to grow as a group in an understanding of where we're going and the process that we're going to be using. I think that we have a tremendous amount of work to do, and I hope that the contributing communities will persevere even with this tight time frame and put together the RFP when it comes out and continue on with the process.
All right. Anybody else? If not, we're adjourned, ladies and